Good afternoon. Welcome to Lyons Den. I'm Maureen Lyons, and today I'm borrowing more storytellers from Moose, which is the Maine organization of storytelling enthusiasts. We've heard historical folklore, we've heard war stories, and have had some comical characters here. These ladies today are going to tell us children's stories, both involving animals. So I want to introduce Susan Dries, to my left, from Wyndham, and Lynn Cullen from Portland. So, Susan, you started telling ghost stories in the Portland Observatory.
Yes, about 30 years ago.
And
about that, it was just happenstance. A friend of mine was a docent there, and they had a storytelling program all set and a storyteller all lined up, and she got sick and didn't show. So in a panic, my friend called me and asked me to tell stories, and I said, I don't tell stories. And she says, well, do you know anybody? And I worked with the library doing the children's story hour. So I said, well, I'll look and see, and I gave her a couple of names, and those people couldn't do it. So I said, well, if you're really hard up, I guess I can do it.
on with the show.
Yes, so I took every ghost story book out of the library.
Yeah.
And I read them to my sons, and they told me which ones they liked. And so those are the ones I ended up telling. And it was quite the experience, nothing that I thought it was going to be like. And I had a wonderful time, and the people there had a wonderful time. And the next day, I got a telephone call asking me if I could come and tell stories at the Kiwanis, and how much do I charge.
Oh.
And it's been going on.
Career was born.
Career was born. And I've been doing it ever since.
And mostly you work with Moose.
Yeah, right now,
Portland.
I mainly work with Moose now, and with my children's, grandchildren's classrooms. And if let's say if a senior class is trying to raise money for project graduation, and they want to have an overnight for the kids, or a babysitting while parents go Christmas shopping, I'll go in and for a minimal fee, I'll go in and tell stories to keep the kids company, or something like that. Or if my grandkids' classrooms, I go in and I tell the teachers that I'm a storyteller, and so I work with them with that.
You said you subbed?
Yes, I did sub.
And you would tell stories to the kids?
Yes, I subbed from kindergarten to 9th grade. And I guess in the junior high, it's hard to get people who would sub consistently there.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. And so they kept on asking me, because they would give me 45 minutes with the children, give me 20 minutes of work, and then with middle schoolers, and 20 minutes with nothing to do. So I would.
Bad combination.
That's a bad combination. So I would start telling them stories, and then they started asking for me. If they would tell a teacher, if you're not going to be here, ask for Mrs. Dries. And so.
So what did you tell them?
Well, it depended. Lots of ghost stories, because they love ghost stories. And if I was working on a story, I would say, now I'm working on a story, I like you to tell it to you, and I want you to tell me what you liked and what you didn't like. And so they would critique it for me. And they loved doing that.
And you had their attention.
And I had their attention. Even though they didn't want me to know I had their attention, I usually had their attention. So it was fun.
So Susan.
Yes.
Would you start, please?
Yes. Okay. I'm going
You can go over
to
there.
come over here. Bring my water. Okay. Well, I have a French folktale. And like all good folk tales, it starts off once upon a time, a long time ago, in a land far, far away, in a land called France, there lived a poor farmer, Antoine, and his wife, Antoinette. And they lived very happily in this little house with their 13 children. It had 2 rooms. Now, they were really excited when their 14th child arrived, a daughter named Claudine. Now, they had, in those days, a rule where children had to have grandparents, a grandfather, a grandmother. And all 13 children had grandparents. But what were they going to do for Claudine? They'd already asked all their friends, all their brothers and sisters, all the relatives that they could possibly think of, and they just could not think of anybody to be a godparent for their dear little Claudine. Well, about 2 weeks after Claudine was born, there's a knock at the door. And Antone went over to the door, opened it up, and there stood this woman. She had wild, scraggly hair that looked like the weeds when the wind blew. She had this wrinkly old face. And the dress, the dress was dirty. It was ratty. It had holes. It had mended. And she had a scarf around her neck, and it was all full of moth holes. And in her hand, she had this tall, scraggly stick, kind of like a broom. And Antone, being a very polite man, said, "How may I help you?" Well, this wild woman said, "I understand that you are looking for a godmother for your daughter. I would love to be the godmother for your daughter." Antone looked at her, and this strange woman to be a godmother for his beloved. No, I'm sorry, but we don't even know you, and we don't want a stranger to be a godparent. No, please go away. Well, this woman with a high voice said, "Do you know who I am?" And she could tell by Antone's face that he didn't. "I am Grinzel the witch." And with that, she took that long stick and she touched it to the baby's head. And she said, "Frog, you shall become and jump into the pond." And with that, the baby disappeared from the crib, and you could hear a croaking sound right outside the window. Well, when Antone and Antoinette saw what happened, they realized, and I will have to say, a little bit too late, that it was Grinzel the witch. And they got down on their knees and they began to beg, "Please, please give us our daughter back. Oh, we're so sorry. Of course you could be our daughter's grandmother. Oh, just bring her back, please." "Oh, what's done cannot be undone," said Grinzel. Well, all the children, all 13 of them, Antone and Antoinette, the crying and the wailing and the sobbing and the screaming and the yelling. It was just too much for a witch to take. And I think just maybe, Grinzel's heart melted maybe just a little bit. And she said, "Well, what is done cannot be undone, but I shall give you 3 wishes to make her life better." Well, Antone jumped up and said, oh, please give her a clean, safe home." "She shall." And with that, the croaking outside the window stopped. And Antoinette jumped up and said, "Oh, please give her a human voice so I can talk to her." "She shall, she shall." And then Claudine's oldest sister said, "Oh, please, please let her marry a handsome, kind man." "All right, it's done." And with that, Grinzel disappeared. And Claudine lived in the marsh outside the village. with clean running water, beautiful marsh grasses, lots of flies and bugs to eat, lots of friends. And every day her family would come down to the marsh and they would talk to her. And they would tell her about life in the village, about the relatives, what they were doing. And she would tell them what she was doing in the marsh. What flies were the best to eat, the best technique to catch the fly. She even told them how she snuck up on one of her friends and zapped them with her tongue, and how she surprised them and how he jumped. Well, after a while, her parents and family didn't come that often. They began coming every so many weeks, and then so many months, and then maybe once a year, and then after a while, only very rarely would they come to visit her. I think the problem was that they really didn't have that much interest in catching flies or bugs or mosses. And she didn't really understand the life in the town. She did not understand the things that they were telling her about. So they kind of went their own way. Except Grinzel. Remember how she just heart melted just a little bit? Well, I think Claudine filled that little bit of heart. And so Grinzel would come down every day, and she would talk to Claudine as her own daughter. Well, one day, Claudine decided, this is boring, the same old thing every day. And she decided that she was going to go and see what the rest of the world was like outside the marsh. Well, she went on down and swam all morning through the river and on down until it came into open fields. And it ran right through them. She had never seen land so flat before. There was a rock. So she thought, well, I'll take a little rest here and I'll look around. And she sat on the rock and she sunned herself, ate a few little flies. And she noticed in one of the fields that there was a farmer and two boys working, and she was watching them. And eventually one of the boys came over. It was Charles. Charles was hot and sweaty and had a bottle of water cooling in the river. And so he went over to the river to get a drink of water. And as he reached down to grab the bottle, he noticed on the rock over there was this beautiful frog. And she seemed to be shining there in the sun. And he thought to himself, my, what a beautiful creature. Well, he had his drink and went back to work. Now, Claudine was very interested by this handsome young man that came to get a drink by the water, and so she watched him work all day long into the evening. Evening came, work stopped. Charles came back down to the river to wash the dirt off his face and hands and to cool his tired feet in the water. And as he sat down, he reached for his bottle of water, and there was that frog again. And he said out loud, kind of to himself and whoever else was listening, "You're still here." And to his surprise, she answered him in human voice. And so she introduced herself as Claudine, and he introduced himself as Charles, and they got talking, and she told him all about how she became a frog, all about the life in the marsh, and he told her about his family and his life, and they seemed to hit it off really good. So he said, "Hey, would you like to come and live with me?" Well, Claudine loved adventure, and this sounded like a really good adventure, so she hopped on his shoulder and said, "Sure." And off they went. Now, Charles lived in the attic of his house. And so there was a great big window on one side that looked over the whole farm. In front of that window, he put a great big iron basin and filled it with water. He found several rocks for her to sun herself on. And every day when he went off to work, he always carried a jar to catch the bugs and the flies and marshes and bring them back to Claudine. And then at night, when he finished work and finished dinner, he would come up and the two of them would sit and talk for hours and hours and hours. And Claudine could not have been happier. So one day when she was looking out the window over the farm, she saw a sparrow fly by, and she asked the sparrow if she could please tell Grinzel where she was and tell her that she was happily living with a man she loved. About 2 weeks later, Charles's father became very ill, and he thought he was going to die. And he realized he had to do something about his farm. So he really couldn't divide it in half because each farm would be too small to support a family. And he loved both of his children dearly and equally, so who was he going to give the farm to? So he came up with this plan. He would give one son the farm, and the other son he would give a bunch of money so that they could go into the city and learn a trade and support himself. But who to pick? Who to give the farm to? Who to give the money to learn a trade? So he decided he would give them a task. And their task was to find a piece of cloth that was 7 times the height of the tower of the farm. Well, when Charles heard that, he ran upstairs and to his room all upset. And what was he going to do? And where was he going to find a piece of cloth? Oh my goodness, 7 times. Nobody could find a piece of cloth that long. And Claudine said, "Don't worry, I have a friend." And so she hopped onto the windowsill and she said, "I'll be back by nightfall." And out she jumped. And Charles ran over to the rear and said, oh, be careful of wagon wheels and little boys with jars." And off she went, off to the marsh to find Grinzel. She found Grinzel and told Grinzel all about Charles and how wonderful he was and how much she loved him and how he might have to go into the city and where do you find a piece of cloth 7 times? 7 times the length of the tower. Oh. Well, Grinzel said, "No problem." And with that, remember that musty old, ratty old, dirty old, yucky old? Well, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a box the size of a pear, a golden box, a shiny, clean golden box. And she gave it to Claudine and said, "Take this. And you give it to that friend of yours, Charles, and when his father's asked for it, then have him open it up in front of him." Well, Claudine thanked Grinzel. "Oh, thank you, thank you, thank you." She went back, gave him the box, told him exactly what to do. And when Charles's brother came back from looking for his piece of cloth that also had to be 7 times the length of the tower, Charles brought his little box. And so his brother, very upset, "This is the longest piece of cloth I could find. I don't know how you can find one 7 times. Let's see." So he took the cloth once, twice, only 3 times the height of the tower. Not enough. Well, Charles got that gold box, opened up the cover, took his cloth, and you can help me count. And it was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Do you think we'll make 6? 6. Oh, please be 7, please be 7, please be 7. 7. 7 times the height of the tower. Oh, joy, now I can live on the farm. Until his father said, "I'm so happy for you, my son. When you find a wonderful wife and marry, the farm will be yours." Marry? Wife? He heard that and he ran up the stairs. "Oh, what are we going to do? Oh my goodness, where am I going to find a wife? I don't want a wife. And marriage? Who even wants marriage? Oh, what am I going to do?" And he started to cry. And Claudine started to cry. She didn't want to go in the city. She didn't want him to marry another woman. Oh, it was a mess. And the two of them sat there, moaning and groaning and crying, and trying to think a way out of this. Well, Charles jumped up and said, I got an idea. Why don't you have Grinzel turn you back into a woman? No, no, that which is done cannot be undone. They sat and they cried and they bemoaned and they thought, and finally Charles jumped up again and said, I have a terrific idea. And so he whispered into Claudine's ear, and then he went and he wrote a letter to his parents telling them that he was leaving and he was going to live with a woman he loved, and that not to worry about him because he was very happy. And then Claudine jumped on his shoulder and they went off to the marsh. And when they got to the marsh, they looked up, Grinzel the witch. And she was so happy to meet this young man, Charles. He was quite nice. But what could she do for him? Well, Charles kind of stepped up and said, well, do you think that possibly you could, well, maybe we thought that you could, well, could you make me a frog? No problem. She took her stick and touched him on the head and said, frog you shall become, and frog you shall remain. Congratulations. Mm-hmm. And before Claudine's eyes, there stood the most handsome frog she had ever met. And the two of them lived forever, happily ever after, in the marsh. And they had 14 children. And Grinzel was the godmother to every single one. And that's the story of Grinzel the witch. There you go.
Yeah, work night.
Yeah.
So, is there anything you'd like to add?
When you were talking about the storytelling in the play, I have found that storytelling has three parts. It has the teller, the story, and the listener. And it takes all three for storytelling to happen. And one of the reasons why I told the story I did tonight was I started telling that story 30-some-odd years ago. And the first time I told that story, and I did not know that much about storytelling at the time, that I had a bunch of first graders in front of me. And so I was telling the story, and Grinzel appears, and the eyes get bigger, and then Grinzel turns Claudine into a frog. Now, when I'm looking at the audience, and Grinzel takes her stick and touches her with her forehead, this little girl over here begins to cry when Claudine's turned into a frog. This little girl on this side of my eye, I can see she's laughing hysterically. She thought it was the funniest thing. And I think that's one of the fun things about storytelling that the audience brings to it is their own imagination
and perception
and all their experiences in their life to the story.
They're very necessary.
Yeah. Yes, and the story would be nothing without their imagination. So that's kind of cool to see what they bring to the story. So I think that's a big difference between movies and plays and puppetry, because all the imagery is done for you, where the audience brings all this stuff in. One time I had, when I was substituting in the school, there was a 9th grader that came up to me afterwards and asked me if I had hypnotized him because he could feel the wet fog on his face. And it wasn't me, it was his imagination that was so powerful that he could actually feel. And so some of the audience members must really get into the stories that they can feel those things.
Are kids listening to stories more or less these days? I mean,
Less.
Less, yeah.
I find less. But that doesn't mean they don't I still, when I go, right now, my main storytelling is going into my grandchildren's classrooms in their third, second, kindergarten, and preschool. And when I go in there, I have no problem.
They listen.
If the story's good, the storyteller's good, and they just bring it. They have that imagination. It's there, and they use it. So yeah, I don't think they get as much, but
Yeah.
I think the imagination is still there for them to
Well,
use.
people like you were bringing it
We hope so.
to all ages,
Yeah, we
which
hope
is
so.
great.
We hope so.
And here, and I want to thank the audience. You
Yes,
always
thank you.
Thank you,
Make it-
audience.
Participation is
It's very important.
Yeah. And thank you,
you for having us.
Susan Dries and Lynn Cullen.
Thank you.
And I think that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed it. Certainly enjoyed the concertina.
Yes, that was nice.
Thank you, Maureen Lyons from Lyons Den